This episode of the Craftsman Online podcast is sponsored by Bricks Masons. From elegant Masonic rings that showcase your commitment to our craft to finely crafted regalia and apparel that honor your tradition, Bricks Masons delivers quality and craftsmanship that truly stands out. Shop now at bricksmasons.com and use promo code CRAFTSMAN, that's CRAFTSMEN, to receive free shipping with your first order.
The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or craftsmanonline.com. Welcome to the Craftsman Online podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. And now your host, Worshipful Brother Michael Arce.
Welcome back. You've joined us for an episode on the art of memory, as we're going to be mastering Masonic Mnemonics with Brother Jason Short, who's back to discuss his recent lecture, The Art of Memory. We'll be traveling back to the Middle Ages to learn when memory and Freemasonry made a connection that has continued throughout time. Welcome back, Brother Short.
Thank you, Brother Arce. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is funny. You and I were just talking. We both, I think, have a reputation for being a bit of a talker. You're definitely growing one in the Grand Lodge of New York for delivering lectures. It could be a bit long. The last one that we spoke of came in at just over an hour. I didn't get a chance to see the art of memory as you're doing the presentation, but I'm just curious, how long is this presentation and what made you select memory as a topic?
So the length of this lecture, I had tried my best to actually keep it a little bit more manageable because I wanted to be able to travel and give this without the fear of me going way over. I think it came in about 45 minutes, maybe up to around an hour with questions, which I think is a good amount of time. I mean, Manly P. Hall, it was 90 minutes. He was in 90 minutes, he was out.
Right.
I think 45 minutes is good.
I think it's also cool that you're building up like a library of presentations or programs that you can deliver in lodges. And now the art of memory is in your catalog. And I didn't want to overlook this question, but what made you select this topic? Why memory?
Back in about 2017, there were a few things going on in my life, and I just really wanted to pull myself together. Started to really commit myself to picking something and improving myself on a yearly basis. And, I worked on my mental health really diligently, then sobriety, giving up alcohol. I tried my hand in Spanish, mathematics, and spirituality. And eventually I got around to memory because I found that a lot of the stuff I was trying to learn to do was a little frivolous without a better capacity for memory. And I never really considered it because I grew up practicing memory a lot with plays, and I hadn't been using mental imagery, which was another thing I had just really started to have my eye opened to. And I was given an opportunity to do this lecture. That was maybe a year and a half after I had already started reading books and being a little bit more diligent into the subject. I felt like it would be fun to actually bring that to a lodge.
A very relatable subject for me. I feel that after COVID, when people talk about the long haul and the effects that have lingered since after COVID, for one of them for me has been memory. And it can sometimes be short-term memory, like where did I put my wallet or my phone? And then I also think, like, is this just something fun that starts to happen when you're in your mid-40s and life decides, hey, we're going to start playing games on you? The other challenge that I have is, and as a Freemason, this is tough, when you go to a lodge meeting and you're just introduced to somebody and you're like, 30 seconds later, I don't remember this brother's name. Can somebody around me say hi to this guy so I don't feel like a jerk because I can't remember his name? Then it also gets to some of the long form memory issues, because there's short, medium, and long memory, where you're sitting here going, I am struggling to try to remember this part of ritual that I know I memorized like 3 or 4 years ago, but I haven't touched this book in a while, or I haven't accessed this part of my brain for a while. Is this what you're covering in your art of memory, is the art of actual remembering?
Memory is very fickle. Like just the process of memory is a very interesting thing. It's like, you know how light passes through a prism and then separates into all of the different bands, and then if you put those bands back through a prism, it turns back into that source of light. Like the way we process reality, we're sensory beings. We process reality, and that input gets separated into a cacophony of different areas of our brain, and that separation is us experiencing reality, and then it all kind of forms back together into this additional thing, which is the imprint of that memory. And so it's a very complicated process that we, I think, take for granted. And I find it very difficult as well. So I'll meet people, I'll have a great conversation with them, I'll walk away and feel like just a like huge jerk because I can't remember their name. I can remember their face, but can't remember their name. The fear of, starting to get into what we do in our work, compounded with meeting new people all the time, I think is a very, very common one, Michael. And like you and me, we struggle with it, then everybody else has at some point, I'm sure, as well.
If this is a common issue that, and good to know, I'm not the only one. Are there techniques that you cover in your presentation that we can use to either cope through this or effectively get better at harnessing the power of our memory?
That's why I thought it was really important for this lecture to bring it to the lodge and calling it Masonic Mnemonics. This idea that I wanted to be able to share some of the things that I've been doing to approach the work with brothers who are just coming through the door. What's fun about that is it actually gets into essentially building your own temples, which is what we are kind of charged to be doing anyway.
Well, let's jump to that part because I know this is a majority of your presentation, and we can always come back and talk about how to be better at mastering proficiency or catechism or ritual tricks that we can do for memorization. But as I told you before we got started with the podcast, from what I saw when you shared your presentation, this is the first program that I can't wait to witness that is more of a demonstration or has more audience participation versus the traditional lecture or modern PowerPoint that we see. So break down what the modern or what the memory palace is that we construct and how you go through this exercise, or maybe we could just play this game together.
What becomes really interesting here is the technique of Loki, popularized, I believe, in the 5th century BCE by this guy named Simonides of Seos. Simonides was hired by this boxer to give a speech in commemoration of a recent victory. He accepted to do this, and he goes to the feast and he gives this wonderful oration. The entire room loves it. Everybody's feasting, and Simonides goes to collect his pay from the boxer, and the boxer tells him to go collect half of his pay from Castor and Pollux. Simonides gets a message at this time. So somebody comes up and tells him that there's two gentlemen outside who need to speak to him. So he leaves prematurely from this feast to go meet whoever it is. And upon leaving the temple, the ceiling collapses in and kills everybody inside. Legend has it Simonides goes outside and meets with Castor and Pollux, who had taken him away from the scene. But the record of this is that the next day, nobody could recognize any of the bodies that had been crushed under the ceiling of the temple. And they called on Simonides as a witness to try to identify the remains. And in that moment, Simonides not only was able to remember the space, it was because he could relate his poem to the locations he moved about the room in his mind's eye. and was able to place and position all of the people and all of the patrons who were sitting around the table at the feast by relocating them through that process. And it was there that the system of Loki was established, and from there on out was popularized. What the system of Loki is what we know today as memory palace technique. I'm sure you're familiar with those memory championships that they do.
No,
Okay.
this is a first for me. I didn't know this was a sport. I don't think I'd be a medalist for sure.
Maybe that's another area of nerddom that that we could get into, but
What are they, like spelling bees or like math competitions? Or
very similar. But
okay,
the competitors, they commit to memory things, and they have different ways of challenging them. There's like memorizing decks of cards is a big thing.
okay.
Long numerical sequences, or they're presented with an original poem every year, and it has to be original because they need to guarantee that nobody's ever heard the poem before.
One thing they could add to a future competition would be the obligation of the Master Mason.
Yes.
I think every worshipful master or anyone who's ever had to confer that would be really appreciate that. But now I can see where you're going with this, because I will never forget, and I'm sure you probably had this in your experience as well, is that when you go through your proficiency and you're working on memorizing and understanding and learning all of the parts of the ritual that you need to know so that you can go from the entered apprentice to the fellow craft to the master mason, and it never fails. There's always that one guy who's got like a photographic memory and can just look at it, and then bang, the next week he gets up and can do the whole thing. And you're like, bro, I am still on like the first paragraph on the first page. How did you just do that? So you've got all of my attention, Jason, all of it.
I am equally amazed by these guys because I'd like to think that I could do that too. And for a while, I started to doubt myself that was even possible. And these brothers who come in and they're like, I got it. But the truth is that this is a skill that anybody can learn.
The Craftsman Online podcast is now sponsored by BricksMasons.com, our favorite destination for all of our Masonic shopping needs. Whether it's apparel for yourself or a cool gift idea for another brother, make BricksMasons.com your online marketplace where tradition meets innovation. Protect the most important book in your collection with a classic and durable leather-bound Masonic book cover. These are nice, full-grain leather, excellent quality, handcrafted by experienced and skilled craftsmen. You get the best finish and double stitching to ensure long-term durability. I love that these covers also come with a nice little pen or pencil holder. That makes taking a writing instrument everywhere pretty easy and handy. The leather-bound cover is available in large through pocket sizes, so you should be able to protect everything from your ritual book to your Masonic Bible with a leather Masonic book cover at BricksMasons.com. Visit BricksMasons.com and explore their extensive catalog. Elevate your Masonic experience with style and substance. Plus, Craftsman Online podcast listeners use promo code CRAFTSMAN, that's CRAFTSMEN, at checkout to enjoy free shipping with your first order. Brothers, do you remember how you felt when you were first called to Freemasonry? The excitement of each degree? If you can still feel that call of the East, you're encouraged to apply to join the Scottish Rite Northern Masonic jurisdiction. The Scottish Rite offers Master Masons like you an opportunity to continue your Masonic journey and delve deeper into our craft through their 29 degrees. And there's an easy way to join the Scottish Rite. It's called Join the Rite Night, a virtual initiation where you can witness the requisite 4th degree and officially become a Scottish Rite Mason. There's 7 opportunities to join online from February 1st to April 25th. Here's what you do. Visit the Scottish Rite online at srnmj.us and click on the Join button. You can also join in person at a Scottish Rite reunion near you. Your journey to the 32nd degree in Freemasonry awaits. Take the first step at srnmj.us and click on the Join button today.
The Memory Palace works through associating our spatial memory and our emotional memory with our visual processes. naturally navigate around our homes, around our workplaces, around the streets, a park. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of these little maps stored inside of us. A memory palace then puts you in your mind's eye into your house, and you move about the space, but instead of seeing the mirror by the door and maybe your coffee table, you replace those items or add additional furnishings that stand out and call to your mind the memory of what it is you're trying to remember.
Just a quick time out here, because this is a lot and really good. Using that initial setup question of, and the kind of history of Loki that you had shared. So what you're suggesting is that if you are introduced to a new brother at a meeting, that you've never been to that lodge room before, and he says, "Hi, my name is Michael." And let's just say we're standing over by the junior warden's chair when this happens. Now you're associating junior warden's chair with the guy that you just met. Is that
Yes.
the connection yours? Okay.
One of the first guys that I really got into, Henry Lorraine, he would go on, I think, the Dick Van Dyke Show, and have the entire audience's names memorized by meeting them all once at the door. His technique for this is, first, every time you meet somebody, make sure you say their name, like actually repeat their name. But to associate a very strong mental picture associates that name with maybe a feature on the person. Why this is important, and not just like putting just like a little Sharpie that says their name on their forehead, maybe that works for some people. The actual neural process behind this is that, as I mentioned before, where when we experience reality and it splits apart into all of these different areas of our brain, how they get tied back together is an imprint that's kind of based on the value of stimuli that was present in that area. And the two main areas that we associate with memory, especially our short-term memory, are amygdala and our hippocampus. The amygdala is your central core for emotional memory, and your hippocampus is the central processor for short term memory and spatial memory. And so when we meet a new brother at the junior warden's chair, first thing is, if we associate them to that chair, that's going to be difficult if we run into him at the supermarket.
Very true.
But if we meet brother Harry at the chair there, and brother Harry is 6'2" and has a little bit of a brow, and we in our mind's eye just picture him, Harry, like Sasquatch or Harry and the Hendersons.
Mm-hmm.
And we say Harry, and even jokingly you could say, you can associate with the person right there, Harry and the Hendersons. You're going to remember that guy.
I've heard this similar trick. President George W. Bush used this when introduced to guests, and it was something that he would do is repeat the person's name back, and then his trick was the first letter of the person's first name. Exactly what you're saying. He would try to find something, facial feature, something about them physically that he could connect with, and just to have that lack of memory, but more of recall, which I don't know if they're the same thing, but yeah, that was his trick.
That is the trick, and it's timeless. And why it works is when we can imagine or make that association, all of those associations we have a sense memory of, and it's that combined with like the location and the other features, it creates a very specific, I like to think of it as like a fingerprint in your mind's eye that will only then register with that memory that you're implanting. And then when you go to recall it, in the process of the process of moving short term into long term memory is a whole nother thing. But the stronger that fingerprint is, then the easier it is to return to it. The stronger those memories become through the process. It's like this process of encoding and then compiling them is just associated with how many of these different sense areas of your brain have provided strong information. And if that's not there when you're observing it, it's up to you, if you want to remember it, to employ an artificial memory technique that aids the image with something that you will emotionally connect to.
I just know that like there's going to be brothers who have listened to this podcast, and I'll be like, okay, nice to meet you. What was the word or the thing about me that you are associating with Michael Arce? Like, I just want to hear what their feedback is. How about something like trying to remember let's say your wife or your girlfriend's phone number, which you should know that in case of emergency, but that's not as simple as taking a facial feature or something and assigning it to a number, as you talked about that memory contest.
Yeah, we would employ this process called linking and chunking. We separate those into the area code, into the first 3 digits, and then the last 4 digits. That's not the number. The number is just the entire string of number. But when we separate it, that's called chunking. Like a good example is my home phone number as a kid is 970-223-7235. As a whole string of numbers, it's a little overwhelming, but when we break it off into the first 3 digits, the second 3 digits, and the last 4 digits, it becomes a little bit easier for our brain to wrap ourselves around it. Other ways you can remember numbers like rhyming or making a system of peg words, which is an advanced memory technique. We could associate all the digits of like 1 to 10 and pick a very strong image for each of those digits. And anytime you get to a date that you have to remember or a number you have to remember, then paint that picture for yourself in your mind's eye. There's also an even better system that links numbers to letters. And when you do that, then you can look at a really long sequence of numbers and, like our cipher, then fill in the blanks and create words. I had no idea that when people said imagine this, they were actually like looking at something in their mind's eye. When I had found out about that, I was devastated because I was learning about aphantasia and was like, "Oh my God, I'm broken. I'm never going to be able to do this kind of work." It turns out training your mind, actual meditation, and intention yields results.
You talked about earlier opening up saying the memory palace, the trick was associating spatial and emotional memory, right? Through the natural process that we have in our minds. And as we're talking about phone numbers and important numbers, right, of people in our lives, I was impressed you still remember your home phone number. I still remember mine as a kid, 602-783-3404, if anybody wants to give that a buzz. That area code doesn't even exist anymore to Yuma, Arizona, so good luck. But and the house is still there, but I'm sure that number is long gone. But I remember when you mentioned that, I thought like going to the phone as a kid and seeing it written. There used to be that little white piece of paper that was right there where the base of the phone was. And I can remember the color blue ink and the handwriting, which would have been my mom's handwriting, that was written on the phone so that when people came to your house and like, yeah, call me back, I'm at this number, and then you could clearly give it. Also, I remember my son getting really offended because he thought I misremembered his birth date. And I'm like, no, dude, I always remember your birth date because I have a little file and then there's a very specific font on the computer that I use for his birthday. And I'm like, every time I close my eyes, as you're saying, like associating emotional with this other spatial type of memory, I think of 11/03 and I see that type of mono style font from the document that I have that has his birth date on it. It's interesting when you said associating letters with numbers, that clearly explains how these people can do a supercalifragilisticexpialidocious length of a number to get there. So very fascinating. So the other example we had talked about with Memory Palace, this is going to be relatable to brothers or just those that have an interest in Freemasonry. is the memory with ritual. And I know that each of us have found little tricks. Can you explain some of the techniques that you have found that can help brothers in Freemasonry with their Masonic ritual memorization?
The type of memory work that we employ in our Masonic catechisms and our ritual is uh, memory verbatim. It's exact recall of individual words, right? It's explicit memory is what they also call it, um, as opposed to memory rerum, or implicit memory, which is just a general memory for things, or like talking points, or how to do something. With the work in Lodge, though, you don't need to do that many reps to remember. Like, for instance, the treasurer says one thing in the entered apprentice degree in New York. In other jurisdictions, might not say anything. The junior deacon, you could do an entire year and you basically say the same 3 or 4 things in opening the lodge, in closing the lodge, and in doing ritual. Yet brothers do stumble over it, and I think it's because they're afraid of nailing it down, or they don't know how to get it stuck in their short-term memory so that it can move into their long-term memory. I find with the memory of verbatim recall, memory palaces are great, but they're only great to get it into your short-term memory or to help with recall. You still need to do the work of recalling it. How things get embedded into the recesses of our mind is like, it's like an echo. It's like a process of putting the memory in there and then pulling it back out, and then putting it back in there and then pulling it out. If you have a really short part, maybe you can come up with a really funny detail to remember, or in the middle chamber lecture, for instance, like to remember the 7 liberal arts and sciences. I use an acronym, and I don't have the middle chamber lecture memorized yet, but Gorilla Gam.
Nice. In my head, I'm like, I know the letters that you're associating with Gorilla Gam. That's awesome.
You could also use a rhyme, or a song. I find sometimes working with an obligation, it's good to maybe find a rhythm, and then start saying it in that rhythm. And then that association that creates it, going back, it creates a stronger fingerprint for you to be able to go back to and work on it in your free time. Or if you're in a pinch, you'll be able to call it to memory a lot easier.
I think the other thing too, playing off what you talked about with the spatial and the emotional part of it and creating that memory palace, is that, let's say you're a senior deacon this year, right, of your lodge, or oh no, you're junior warden.
I'm the treasurer this year.
Oh. Okay. I was gonna say, well, then that's no fun, because your part of the ritual is literally, imagine the secretary coming over and doing what he has to do, and you taking the receipt and okay, that's really simple. But for a brother that might be a senior deacon, I always say, well, put yourself in that situation of, what was it like when you were the candidate going through this? And this is why I think our catechism or proficiency ritual is really helpful to advance through the degrees, because it is trying to lay those breadcrumbs of saying, basically, where were you at this time? What were you doing? And then you fill in the blank of, why was this significant? Because we really don't cover that in the catechism, except for certain parts where things are explained to you. The rest of it, you're supposed to go find out the answer. So I think kind of using the techniques that you're talking about, it should help guys. Because I know when I was studying the part of the senior deacon, I thought about it. I was like, okay, so the guy's going to come in, this is going to happen, and then I'm going to do this to him. And oh my gosh, I remember when that happened to me. It was one of the most significant, weird parts of the night. And I'm like, is this going to happen the next 2 times I come through there? Because I'm not going to come through that door.
And is it going to be more intense?
Yeah. You're going to run out of places to poke me, guys.
One of the things, going back to that emotional aspect of like having the spatial memory and being able to like understand understand, I'm going to go over here, I'm going to say this, and then for the brother or the candidate, whoever goes through and experiences that on the other end, that moment that we're talking about right there is a very, very specifically memory oriented moment. It even talks about remembering what that is, and that this should help for you to remember it. If you just look at your ritual monitor and you're just seeing the words and you're just kind of like speaking it out loud and hoping that sits in your mind, it's not going to stay there. It's going to be like trying to hold water in a leaky bucket. If you put yourself there and you really actually think about what you're saying, what are you communicating here and why? All of a sudden that cacophony of the different parts of your brain associating with the words that you're saying, they start doing different things. It starts to become a little bit of a symphony. You might have the drum, which is the words, but then all of a sudden, like, you have a little cello in the background because there's a little bit of pain associated there, and then you have a violin come in because there's this excitement that you associate with whatever. I mean, I'm not a musician. I
basically started outlining Peter and the Wolf here.
Yeah. But by understanding, like, saying what we mean and engaging ourselves into that moment mentally, it imprints upon our memory something that becomes very difficult to forget.
To testify, I'll say probably one of the greatest things, and I tell every new brother when I get them finally into my clutches for their Masonic education, I tell them the story of my mother lodge. We went up to the Masonic Care Community Center in Utica, New York, and we exemplified a degree for the brothers that were there. It was amazing because these guys were getting literally wheeled in wheelchairs, and we're performing the ritual, and I'm sitting in the chair as a steward and watching these brothers mouth the words of the degree ritual who hadn't been able to attend a lodge meeting or seen a degree probably in a decade, if not more. It will stay in your brain if you make it get in there.
When I put myself towards trying to understand my memory a little bit better and trying to improve my memory, that I mentioned Henry Lorraine. One of his books that I first read was called Ageless Memory, and that actually gets into, there's this misnomer that as we get older, our memory capacity depletes, and it's not that. It's that we allow ourselves to atrophy because we don't pay attention to it. But you think with Masonic ritual, the amount of repetitions that we do, if you were a brother of the craft and God willing, you've been able to retire into such a beautiful place as Utica, or any of the Masonic villages and homes, and you've been able to experience 30 to 50 plus years of the craft. Imagine how many times you said that. Imagine how many times you heard that. And those are things that you're never going to forget. The process of inculcation, the process of hearing it and like listening to what's being said, and then connecting it into your heart, like, it might be one of the things that just like sets Masons apart. Maybe not to get into the hermetic side of all of this, but for those brothers, the amount of times that they actually said that ritual, it's part of their very fiber of being at that point. But I imagine too that with Masonry, God willing, I live to a ripe old age, I hope that there are things that I can never forget.
The Arts of Masonic Mnemonics. Again, big thanks to our friend, Brother Jason Short, for coming back on the Craftsman Online podcast and sharing his research into the inner workings of our mind and memory. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure you follow the Craftsman Online podcast on Spotify or hit subscribe on Apple Podcasts. We are available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. And a few moments from you means a whole lot to us. If you could open up that podcast player, like, comment, give us a nice review. It helps connect the Craftsman Online podcast with those that have an interest in Freemasonry. Until next Monday, let peace and harmony prevail.